I never thought a wedding could turn into one of the strangest, most unexpectedly sweet weekends of my life. But here we are. Honestly, I was just there because my cousin begged me to come. Not because I'm a big fan of weddings or family gatherings. Let's just say the idea of spending an entire weekend making small talk with distant relatives wasn't exactly my dream scenario. But hey, free food and an open bar usually soften the blow. The plan was simple: show up, be polite, maybe dance a little, and then disappear into the night without too many awkward questions about my love life. Easy, right? Except life never hands you straightforward plans. So I get to the hotel where everyone's staying, and it's one of those places where the lobby smells faintly of cheap cologne and panic because half the wedding party is running late. I'm checking in, keeping my head down, when the receptionist tells me my roommate isn't the cousin I was expecting. Instead, I find out there's been some mix-up, and I'm sharing the room with a complete stranger. Q, the classic sitcom moment. Except this wasn't some quirky TV show. This was my weekend reality. When the guy shows up, I'm not sure if I should be annoyed, amused, or just confused out of my mind. He's tall, effortlessly messy in that way where his hair looks like it's been styled by a breeze and good luck, and he's wearing a leather jacket over a wrinkled dress shirt, which kind of doesn't fit the typical wedding guest vibe. Then he smiles. This slightly crooked, easy smile that somehow makes me forget I was just about to curse the universe for this rooming disaster. "Hey," he says, dropping his bags on one side of the room like he owns the place. "I'm Nate." "Ben," I reply, trying to act chill, even though inside I'm thinking, okay, this is already more interesting than I expected. We're supposed to keep this quick, say hi, sort out the details, and then go our separate ways for the weekend. But the thing about random roommates at weddings, they have a way of sticking around longer than you plan. Turns out, Nate wasn't just some random guy. He's actually an old friend of my cousin's fiance, which explains why he's here last minute. He's got this calm, steady energy that's kind of contagious. We end up talking for a while, swapping stories about how we both ended up at this wedding with no clue what we were getting ourselves into. There's something about the way he talks. Easy, unfiltered, like he's not trying to impress anyone but still manages to. I find myself laughing more than I expected, and even sharing stuff I usually keep to myself. Like how I'm terrible at small talk but somehow always get stuck at events like this. Or how I secretly hoped this thing would be over fast so I could get back to my normal, boring life. And then, just as I'm starting to think this random roommate thing might not be so bad, the power flickers and the lights go out. Suddenly, we're sitting in the dark, with only the city lights sneaking in through the window. Nate pulls out his phone, shines a light, and grins like it's the perfect opportunity for some kind of adventure. That's when I realized this weekend might be less about surviving a wedding and more about something I didn't see coming at all. He flicked on his phone flashlight, casting a narrow beam across the room. The warm glow caught the dust motes floating in the stale air, and I found myself staring at the familiar clutter of a hotel room. 2 beds, a cheap dresser, a stale smell of air freshener trying desperately to cover up something else. But now, it was just the two of us, surrounded by the quiet hum of a powerless building. "Guess we're stuck here for a bit," Nate said, voice low, like he was amused by the unexpected situation rather than annoyed. "Yeah," I replied, shifting to sit on the edge of the bed. It was weird how quickly the whole scene shifted from awkward to kind of comfortable. "So what do you usually do when the power goes out?" he shrugged, dropping down onto the bed across from me. "Depends. On a normal night, probably curse whoever's in charge of maintenance. Here? Probably just try not to freak out the cousins." We both laughed, and for a second the wedding outside, the awkward small talk, the stressful family dynamics, all of it felt miles away. "What about you?" Nate asked after a beat. "Ben, right? What do you usually do when things go sideways?" I thought about that for a moment. Usually I try to keep control. Plan everything out, avoid surprises, but this weekend had already blown all that to hell. Honestly, I usually just try to find a bar and disappear, I admitted. He smiled again, that crooked grin that somehow made me feel less alone in the room. Sounds like my kind of strategy. There was a pause, and then, Like he was deciding whether to share something, he said, "You know, sometimes it's nice when things don't go as planned." I didn't say anything at first, just let the thought hang in the air. He was right. This whole accidental roommate thing was already changing how I looked at this weekend. The lights flickered back on before I could respond. The sudden brightness felt almost jarring after the darkness, but it also snapped me out of whatever haze I'd been drifting in. "Well," Nate said, standing up and stretching like he hadn't moved all day. "Power's back. Back to the chaos." I nodded, suddenly aware that the wedding was probably in full swing again. Music, laughter, that kind of happy noise that's supposed to mean good times but often just stresses me out. Then Nate surprised me. "You want to get out of here for a bit? Maybe check out the city? I know a place nearby that's way better than any hotel bar." I blinked. I wasn't sure if it was the lingering blackout or just him being unexpectedly charming, but the idea sounded good, like a break from the scripted family weekend. "Yeah," I said before I could second-guess myself. "Let's do it." We grabbed our jackets and slipped out of the hotel, stepping into the cool night air. The city felt alive, buzzing quietly under the streetlights, but somehow less overwhelming than the hotel lobby full of strangers in fancy clothes. Nate led the way down a few side streets until we reached a tiny, unassuming bar tucked between two closed storefronts. The sign was faded, but the warm light spilling out onto the sidewalk made it look inviting. Inside, the place was cozy, with mismatched chairs, a few scattered regulars, and a jukebox playing some old rock song. Nate grabbed 2 beers from the bartender and handed me one like it was the best thing in the world. We found a booth in the corner and settled in. For the first time all weekend, I felt like I could breathe. "So," Nate said, leaning back with a smirk, "tell me the truth. What's the real story behind you being dragged to this wedding?" I took a sip of my beer, feeling the cold liquid calm my nerves. "Honestly, my cousin's the kind of guy who thinks weddings are this big, perfect moment for family bonding. I'm more of a family as little as possible guy. But, you know, I owe him. Sounds like he got roped into the whole thing." Nate laughed, eyes sparkling in the dim light. "Yeah, pretty much. And you? What's your deal? You just here for the party, or is there some backstory I'm missing?" He hesitated just for a second before answering. "I'm friends with the groom, actually. We've known each other since college. But it's complicated." He didn't elaborate, and honestly, I didn't press. The conversation drifted into easier territory after that. Favorite bands, terrible movies we both secretly liked, childhood stories that made us both cringe. It felt natural, like I'd known him longer than just a few hours. Later, when we stepped outside, the night had cooled even more, and the city lights stretched out before us like a promise of something new. Nate turned to me, his expression softer now. "You ever think about how random moments like this can change everything?" I looked at him, suddenly aware of how close we were standing, how the night air seemed charged. "Yeah," I said quietly. "I think I'm starting to." Something shifted between us then, a silent understanding that this weekend was no longer just about a wedding or awkward family obligations. It felt like the start of something neither of us expected, but maybe both of us were waiting for. And honestly, I couldn't wait to see where it went. We stood there for a moment, just taking it in. The city sprawled out beneath us, the hum of distant traffic, the occasional shout or laugh from late-night wanderers. The kind of quiet that only happens when you're sharing it with someone, not alone. I caught myself glancing at Nate more than once, noticing things. The way his eyes caught the streetlight, the way his mouth curled, just so when he was thinking. "Hey," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. "Want to walk? I know this crazy little park a few blocks down. It's got a view that'll make you forget all about the wedding chaos." I hesitated a bit, mostly because the idea of wandering around the city at midnight with a stranger-turned-roommate was exactly the kind of spontaneous thing I usually avoided. But with Nate, the risk felt right. "Lead the way," I said. We took off down the street, the sound of our footsteps mixing with the night. It wasn't a big park, more like a quiet patch of green tucked between buildings, but it had this little overlook where you could see the whole skyline glittering. Nate claimed it was his secret spot when he needed to get away. When we got there, we settled on a bench, and I realized I hadn't felt this relaxed in ages. The city lights stretched out before us, a sea of gold and white, and the air was cool but not cold. I come here when I feel like I'm stuck, Nate said after a while. It's like a reset button, you know? I nodded. Yeah, I get that. Sometimes you just need to step back and see the bigger picture. He looked at me then, really looked. There was something open in his eyes that made me want to be honest, to drop the usual walls. So, I started. What's the complicated part you mentioned earlier? About the groom? He sighed, leaning back on the bench. It's weird. We used to be close. Best friends in college. But then, things got messy. Life happened. We drifted. This wedding, it's like the last thing keeping us connected. I didn't push, just listened. There was something about the way he spoke. No bitterness, just a quiet sadness wrapped in acceptance. Sound rough, I said softly. Yeah, but maybe this weekend is a chance for things to change, or at least to close the chapter right. We sat in silence for a bit, the kind that's comfortable even when it's heavy. Then, out of nowhere, Nate chuckled. You know, you're not so bad for a guy who hates weddings. I smiled, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the chilly night. I could say the same about you. That's when it hit me. This random roommate, the guy the first never would have expected to connect with, was maybe the best part of this trip. As we made our way back to the hotel, the streets quieter now, Nate reached out and brushed a stray lock of hair from my forehead. The touch was brief, but electric. Ben, he whispered, I'm glad we ended up rooming together. Me too, I said, heart suddenly pounding. Back at the hotel, the reality of the weekend waited. Family, ceremonies, the usual chaos. But for the first time, I felt like I wasn't just going through the motions. There was something real here, something I wanted to hold on to. That night, as I lay in bed, I caught myself thinking about Nate's smile, his easy confidence, the way he looked at me like I wasn't invisible. Maybe this wedding wasn't just about two people getting hitched. Maybe, just maybe, it was about finding something unexpected in the middle of all the noise. And honestly, I was ready to see where it went. The next morning came too fast, like it always does after nights that feel too short and moments that stick in your head. I woke up with that half glow of memory and reality blurring, the city skyline, the quiet bench, Nate's hand brushing my hair. I shook it off, mostly because weddings don't pause for feelings, and I still had to face a full day of family and fake smiles. But there was a difference now. The usual dread didn't hit me as hard. Somehow, Nate's easy presence had shifted something inside me, like a small crack in the wall I'd been building around myself. We met for breakfast in the hotel lobby, where everyone looked a little worse for wear but still buzzing from last night's festivities. Nate was already there, sitting with his usual casual slouch, scrolling on his phone like he owned the place. Morning, I said, sliding into the chair across from him. Morning, stranger, he replied with that same crooked grin. We talked about everything and nothing, how the reception probably wouldn't start on time, which relatives were already getting too drunk, and the fact that the hotel's coffee was terrible. It felt normal, like hanging out with an old friend instead of someone I just met. Later that afternoon was the rehearsal dinner, and, as expected, the place was packed with a mix of family, friends, and people who liked the idea of fancy dinners with awkward speeches. I found myself stuck next to one of my cousin's college buddies, who talked non-stop about his startup and how disruptive it was. I was halfway through nodding politely when Nate slid into the seat beside me. Hey, I saved you, he whispered with a smirk, nudging me like we shared some secret. The timing was perfect because I desperately needed an escape. We exchanged quick glances, a silent agreement passing between us that maybe we'd make it through this without losing our minds. After dinner, the real chaos started, the toasts. I'm not sure who decided it was a good idea to give every distant relative the mic, but suddenly we were trapped in a series of long-winded speeches about love, family, and the journey ahead. Nate leaned in, whispering jokes under his breath that cracked me up despite myself. When the speeches finally ended, Nate grabbed my hand and pulled me toward the dance floor. Come on, he said. You're not getting out of dancing that easily." I protested, but he was already dragging me along. The music was loud and a little cheesy, but with Nate by my side, it felt less like torture and more like fun, maybe even a little exciting. We found a rhythm, not perfect, but enough to make us laugh and forget about the crowd watching. At one point, I caught him looking at me with this expression that was part amusement, part something deeper. My heart flipped. As the night wore on, the energy shifted. The formalities faded, replaced by the kind of spontaneous moments that make you realize weddings aren't just about two people. They're about connection, surprise, the unexpected. At one point, Nate pulled me away from the crowd, toward a quiet corner near the patio. "Can I be honest?" he asked, voice low. "Always," I said. He hesitated for a second, then said, "I wasn't sure about coming here, about this wedding. But meeting you, it's changed things." There it was again, that mix of vulnerability and confidence that I couldn't get enough of. "I feel the same way," I admitted. "I thought this weekend was going to be a drag, but you make it something else." He smiled, a slow, genuine smile that reached his eyes. Then, without warning, he leaned in and kissed me. It was soft, tentative, like testing the waters, but in that moment, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. The world shrank to just us. The noise, the flashing lights, the expectations, all fading away. When we pulled apart, I was breathless, heart racing. "Wow," I said, still trying to catch my breath. Nate laughed softly. "Yeah, me too." We spent the rest of the night wrapped up in that feeling, stealing quiet moments when no one was looking, savoring the thrill of something new and unexpected. By the time the weekend rolled around to the actual wedding day, I knew one thing for sure. This trip was no longer about surviving a family event. It was about seeing where this us could go. And honestly, I was ready to find out. The wedding day itself kicked off with that weird energy only big family events can have. Half excitement, half exhaustion, and way too much caffeine. I got up early, trying to shake off the lingering buzz from last night, but my mind kept drifting back to Nate. To the way his hand felt in mine when we snuck away, to the quiet smiles we shared over the chaos of the rehearsal. It was weirdly comforting, like I'd found a secret safe place right in the middle of all this madness. We met up in the hotel lobby before heading to the ceremony. Nate looked sharp, his usual leather jacket swapped out for a well-fitted blazer that made me realize, maybe, he knew how to clean up better than I gave him credit for. I tried to match his energy, but ended up just feeling a little awkward in my too-tight tie and unfamiliar dress shoes. "So," Nate said, flashing that grin that made my stomach do backflips, "ready to watch two people make a lifetime commitment while we figure out what we're doing?" I laughed, the tension easing. "Ready as I'll ever be." The ceremony itself was, well, it was a wedding. Lots of heartfelt vows, some teary eyes, and the kind of music that's designed to make you feel all the feelings at once. I caught Nate's eye during a particularly sappy moment, and he winked at me, silently saying, "We got this." Afterward came the reception, dancing, eating, and enough socializing to make me want to run for the hills. But Nate and I carved out our own little bubble, sneaking away when we could, sharing quiet jokes and stolen glances. It was like we'd found a secret rhythm amid the noise. At one point, we ended up outside on the hotel's rooftop deck. The night air was crisp, and the city lights stretched endlessly around us. Nate pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders and looked over at me with that thoughtful expression he reserved for moments like this. "Ben," he said quietly, "I know this weekend started weird. Roommates by accident, power outages and all that. But I'm really glad it did. I felt my heart catch. Me too." There was a pause, and then he asked, "What do you want from this? From us?" Honestly, I hadn't thought that far ahead. I was still caught up in the rush of everything. But looking at him, really looking, made me realize I wanted more than just a weekend fling or a random story to tell. "I want to see where this goes," I said, surprising myself with how sure I sounded. Nate smiled, a slow, genuine smile that made me feel like maybe, just maybe, we were on the same page. We leaned into each other then, the city humming around us, but all I could hear was the quiet beating of my own heart. The kiss this time was different, more confident, more sure. It was like we were both promising something without words. When we finally pulled apart, I felt lighter, like I was stepping into something new and real. But then reality crept back in. The weekend was almost over, and soon we'd have to go back to our separate lives, me to my solo apartment and Nate to wherever he called home. "I don't want this to end," I said, voice barely above a whisper. "Neither do I," he replied. We spent the rest of that night talking about everything and nothing. Plans, fears, what the future might hold. And for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. The next morning came all too soon. As we packed up our things, the room felt heavier, like the magic of the weekend was slipping away. Nate paused by the door, turning to look at me with those intense eyes. "So, what now?" I smiled, feeling a mix of nerves and excitement. "Now? We figure it out. Together." He reached out, grabbing my hand one last time before we stepped into the world beyond the wedding, a world that suddenly felt a lot less scary with him in it. And as I walked away, I knew this was just the beginning of a story I never saw coming, and one I was more than ready to write. Back home, the quiet was almost deafening after the buzz of the wedding weekend. My apartment felt too empty without Nate's easy presence filling the space, even if it was only for a few days. I found myself staring at my phone more than usual, scrolling through messages, half expecting to see a text from him. But the screen stayed stubbornly blank. I thought by now we'd have a plan, some kind of roadmap for what together meant outside the whirlwind of that hotel room and city nights. But real life has a way of pulling you back, reminding you that spontaneity doesn't always come with instructions. Then the message popped up. Just a simple "hey" from Nate, but it made my chest tighten in the best way. We started texting, at first cautiously, like two people checking the water before diving in. We traded stories from our days apart, the mundane details that somehow felt important because we were sharing them. Slowly, the conversations got longer, more personal. We talked about hopes, doubts, the stuff that doesn't usually come up in casual chats. One night, after a long day at work, I found myself thinking about Nate's laugh. That way it could fill a room and make everything feel lighter. I sent him a text. "Missing you." His reply was quick. "Counting the days until I see you again." That was when it hit me. This wasn't just a fling. It was something real, something worth holding on to despite the distance and the chaos. A few weeks later, Nate showed up at my door, suitcase in hand, wearing that same leather jacket from the wedding weekend. His smile was a little shy this time, like he wasn't sure if I'd be ready for him. But I was. More than ready. We spent the weekend exploring the city, late-night dinners, lazy mornings, and endless conversations that made me realize how much I had been missing. There was an ease between us, a quiet understanding that made even the simplest moments feel special. One afternoon, we found ourselves sitting in a small park, watching the world go by. Nate reached over, took my hand, and squeezed it gently. "Ben," he said softly, "I don't want to be the guy who just crashes a wedding and disappears. I want more." I looked at him, feeling the weight of those words, and knew I felt the same. "I want that too," I admitted. From that moment on, things started to feel different. We weren't just that random roommate situation anymore. We were building something. Slowly, carefully, but with real intention. Of course, it wasn't always easy. There were moments of doubt, the awkward conversations about what this meant for the future, and the challenge of blending two lives that had been separate for a long time. But with Nate, it felt worth it. One evening, as we sat on my couch watching an old movie, he looked over and said, "Funny how a chance rooming mix-up turned into this." I laughed, leaning into him. "Yeah, life has a weird sense of humor." He smiled, resting his head on my shoulder, and I knew that whatever came next, we'd face it together. Looking back, I realized that random roommate at my cousin's wedding wasn't just some quirky story. It was the start of something that changed my life in ways I never expected. And honestly, I wouldn't have it any other way. A few months had passed since Nate showed up at my door, and somehow, the strange randomness of that wedding weekend had evolved into something solid, something I wasn't just clinging to out of novelty. It felt real, tangible, like maybe I was ready for it. But life being life, nothing ever gets that simple. One Friday evening, we were sitting on my couch after a long week, Nate's head resting on my shoulder as I flicked through channels, half listening to the background noise. I was scrolling through my phone when a notification popped up. A message from my cousin. Just a quick text. Hey, you coming to the family barbecue next weekend? I showed Nate the message, and he raised an eyebrow. Family BBQs. The next big adventure? I groaned. More like a test of my patience. He laughed softly. Well, you've survived the wedding. How bad could a barbecue be? Famous last words. The weekend arrived, and as expected, the barbecue was its own brand of chaos. Relatives I hadn't seen since the wedding cornered me with questions, some polite, others downright nosy. Nate stayed close, acting like my quiet anchor amid the noise. At one point, Aunt Karen, the family member officially designated as the interrogator, sidled up with a plate of potato salad and a knowing smile. So, Ben, she said, tell me about this. Nate fellow. He seems nice. I glanced at Nate, who was calmly refilling his drink, unaware he was center stage. Well, I started, trying to keep it casual. He's my roommate from that wedding weekend. And now, well, he's kind of stuck with me. Karen raised an eyebrow. Stuck, huh? That sounds promising. I laughed, feeling the warmth of Nate's hand squeezing mine under the table. Later, as the sun dipped and the barbecue wound down, Nate and I found a quiet spot behind the garden shed. The air was cooler, the sounds of the party muffled. I have to admit, Nate said, I wasn't sure how the family stuff would go. Yeah, me neither, I replied. But you handled it way better than I did. He shrugged. I guess when you're used to crashing weddings and crashing into people's lives, you get good at rolling with it. I smiled, feeling that familiar flutter in my chest. That night, back at my place, we talked long into the early hours, about family, about us, about the weird ways life throws people together. You ever think about what comes next? Nate asked quietly. I considered it. I do, but I try not to rush it. I want this to grow on its own. He nodded, his gaze steady. Me too. Days turned into weeks, and our routines settled into something comfortable but exciting. I started introducing Nate to parts of my life I'd kept private, the local coffee shop where I hid from the world, the beat-up guitar I hadn't touched in years, the little park bench where I could think. Nate did the same, sharing stories of his past, the friendships he'd lost, and the dreams he still chased. There was a vulnerability between us that made the connection deeper than I expected. One evening, we took a spontaneous road trip to the coast. The drive was filled with music, laughter, and those quiet moments when words weren't necessary. On the beach, under a sky full of stars, Nate turned to me. Ben, I don't want to just be a chapter in your story. I want to be part of the whole book. I looked at him, the waves crashing softly behind us, and knew I felt the same. I want that too, I said, reaching for his hand. That night marked a new beginning, not just for us, but for everything we'd been hesitant to admit. Hope, trust, the kind of love that sneaks up when you least expect it. Looking back, it's crazy how a random roommate at a wedding turned into the person who changed everything. And honestly, I'm grateful every day that life threw me that curveball. The months that followed felt like a gentle unfolding, no grand gestures or dramatic declarations, just two people learning how to be together in the messy, unpredictable way life works. Nate and I settled into a rhythm that didn't erase the weirdness of how we met, but somehow made it feel like the perfect beginning. One evening, a little over a year after that chaotic wedding weekend, I found us sitting on my couch, the city lights casting a soft glow through the window. We were quiet for a while, just sharing space, and it hit me how much comfort there was in that silence. Nate turned to me and smiled that same crooked grin that had drawn me in from day one. You ever think about how random moments change everything? I nodded, squeezing his hand. All the time. I never imagined a wedding mix-up would lead me here. He laughed softly. Me neither. But honestly, I can't imagine life without you now. It wasn't some fairy tale ending or a dramatic confession. It was simple and real. A moment that felt earned because of all the small steps we'd taken together. I brushed a stray hair from his forehead, and leaned in, kissing him softly. When we pulled apart, I whispered, "I'm glad you were my random roommate." He chuckled. Best accident I've ever had. As we sat there, wrapped up in each other and the quiet hum of the city, I realized that sometimes the best stories don't come from planning or perfect moments. They come from the unexpected, the chance encounters, the mistakes that turn out to be magic. Nate wasn't just a random roommate. He was the person who showed me how to open up, how to take a chance, and how love can find you when you least expect it. And that, more than anything, felt like the kind of ending worth holding on to.